state, a nation.
It seems so extreme.
Divided, but also connected by a shared opportunity.
I think every election is important.
The right to vote, the ultimate act of hope in our democracy, the chance to make an informed decision on Election Day. Tonight, a deeper look at your candidates for U.S. Senate.
All right, well, good evening, Texas.
The challenger, Colin Allred.
We have not been getting things done that we need to be getting done. We have not been delivering for Texans in a way that I think we should be. We have so many issues that need to be solved.
The incumbent, Ted Cruz.
My job in the Senate is to fight every day for 30 million Texans, to fight for jobs, to fight for freedom, to fight for security.
Outside the noise of the campaign trail, taking time to go beyond the talking points.
I try to keep a level head, as I said, in part, because that's also how you make good decisions.
You know, I think we need more real conversations.
Uncovering context, revealing a more complete look at the candidates, asking for your vote on Election Day.
This is Campaign Context in Texas's race for U.S. Senate.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Daniel Marin. Tonight, an in-depth look at the candidates running for the U.S. Senate seat on the ballot here in Texas. You likely know the names: incumbent Senator Ted Cruz and U.S. Representative Colin Allred. Cruz, the unapologetic conservative incumbent who brands himself as a fighter for security, jobs, and limited governments. Allred, the Democrat who defeated a longtime Republican incumbent to earn a seat in Congress. A civil rights attorney, Allred is passionately opposed to the state's abortion law and critical of border policies proposed by both Republicans and Democrats. Two vastly different candidates running to represent you in the U.S. Senate for the next 6 years in what's one of the most politically polarizing times in our nation's history. But also two individuals, each with a set of life experiences and values that inform decisions on policy related to things like the border, the economy, and reproductive rights, decisions that affect you. I recently spent an afternoon with each candidate, away from the noise and the rhetoric of the campaign trail, to take an unhurried approach and learn things you won't hear in a soundbite or a political ad. My conversations with Senator Cruz and Congressman Allred went beyond the talking points and provided context on the issues Texas voters say are most important to them. So tonight, in this 1-hour special, our in-depth conversations with your U.S. Senate race candidates. Wow, this is a great place. Senator, thank you so much for having us in your home.
Absolutely.
How would you balance the things that you would like to see happen when it comes to the border? Things like building the border wall, reinstating that, also reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy you've said. So how would you balance all of those with the needs and contributions of the immigrant community in Texas?
So listen, for a long time, I've described my views on immigration in 4 words: legal, good; illegal, bad. I think most Texans agree with that. I think most Americans agree with that. As you noted, I'm the son of an immigrant. My father came from Cuba with nothing. My dad was imprisoned in Cuba. He was tortured in Cuba. When he came to Texas, it was 1957. He was a teenager. He was 18. He couldn't speak English. He had $100 in his underwear. And he went to go to the University of Texas. He was a freshman. He'd just been admitted to UT. He arrived in Austin. His very first job, he washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And he came to America because he was seeking freedom. Our state, our nation is built by those risking everything seeking freedom. I think that is an amazing part of our heritage. Now, that being said, there's a right way to come to this country. You follow the law, you follow the rules, you wait in line, you come legally. And I will say what's happening at our southern border, it is a crisis unlike any we've seen in the history of our country. I spend a lot of time down there. It has never been remotely this bad. We've had over 11 million illegal immigrants cross into this border illegally. And you ask, how do you fix it? You know what's frustrating? This crisis is man-made, and it is Joe Biden and Colin Allred and the Democrats that created this crisis. Why is that? Because when Biden came into office, he inherited a border that was largely secure. He inherited the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. I had worked hand in hand with President Trump, and we had largely secured the border. We'd achieved incredible victories securing the border. All Biden had to do was nothing. Just don't screw it up. But instead, what did he do? He came in and he deliberately broke the border. It was 3 decisions he made, and they were all unilateral executive decisions. Number 1, you rightly noted, he halted building the border wall. Did that on the first day in office. Number 2, he reinstated the disastrous policy of catch and release. So now that we apprehend people here illegally, they let them go. And number 3, he pulled out of the unbelievably successful Remain in Mexico agreement. Remain in Mexico is how we'd gotten the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. The result of that, the numbers exploded. And they didn't do so gradually over 6 months. They happened overnight. We went from the lowest rate in 45 years to the highest rate in the history of our country. All of that is deliberate. The good news, though, because it was done by unilateral executive action, it can be undone by unilateral executive action. And I believe if and when Donald Trump is reelected in November and we get a Republican Senate, we get a Republican House, in January, you are going to see the border secured once again because President Trump is going to reverse those 3 decisions. We're going to build the wall again. We're going to end catch and release. We're going to reinstate Remain in Mexico. And we will see the numbers plummet, which is what the people of Texas want and deserve.
You mentioned your father and his journey with immigration.
Yeah.
When you see the images of people gathered at the border en masse, and I've heard you say in other interviews that it's a sad thing to see.
Of course, it's tragic.
Do you see your father and those people in that crowd?
No, because my father came here legally. And there is a right way to come. And I got to say, we have millions of legal immigrants. Every year, the United States lets in about 1 million people legally. You know, there's no country on the face of the earth that is more generous with welcoming immigrants than the United States is. That's a good thing. That is a strength of our country. But there is a right way to come. What is happening at the southern border, it's interesting, Daniel. You cannot see it firsthand and defend it. There used to be a time, I was down at the border a number of months ago, and a reporter asked me, said, well, aren't the policies of the Democrats a lot more compassionate and humane when it comes to the border? I just started laughing. And I said, you know who doesn't believe that anymore? Democrats. And I just asked the reporter, I said, where's Joe Biden? Where's Kamala Harris? Where is even a single Democrat senator? Where's a single Democrat House member? By the way, where's Colin Allred? Have you seen him doing any border trips? Have you seen him going out on midnight patrol with the Border Patrol agents and encountering, as you do every time, children who've been abused, who've been brutalized? You cannot see what is happening at the southern border and defend it. Last year, 853 migrants died crossing the border illegally. When I brought 19 senators down to the border, we went out on the Rio Grande River. We saw a man floating dead in the river who had died that day. When you sit down with Texas farmers and ranchers and they show you photograph after photograph of dead bodies they find on their ranches, this is not compassionate. This is cruel.
You have a new ad touting that you stood up to President Biden when it comes to the border. Back in January, you were one of 3 Texas Democrats who supported a resolution to condemn President Biden's handling of the southern border. I guess just kind of walk us through your evolution of thought on this. You now support the president's executive orders that came out recently. What do you say for folks who see the ad as maybe some kind of flip-flop on the issue?
Yeah. Well, I've got a personal story with this because my family's from Brownsville, and my grandfather was a customs officer after serving in the Navy in the Pacific in World War II. It's where my mom and my aunt grew up. I spent a lot of my childhood there. And I've always seen our border communities as not just places that you go to point out problems, but as places where real folks are living, trying to raise their families, and where I think they expect us to have responsible responses to what's happening. And what we have seen is that we've had a change to where in the last month of December of 23, we had a record number of crossings, 300,000 in a month. I think that's around the same as we had in the last year of the Obama presidency. The facts on the ground have changed. We do have a crisis at the border. Venezuela is in collapse. We've seen millions of Venezuelans fleeing Venezuela. We've seen what's happening in Haiti in terms of the gang violence that's forcing so many Haitians out of Haiti. We know what's still happening in the Northern Triangle countries, and this is also a global phenomenon that countries all over the world are facing. And so it requires a response. We have to respond with smart policy. And this is where I get really frustrated because I see Ted Cruz with a bipartisan effort in the United States Senate to bring billions of dollars to this issue for more immigration judges, for more Border Patrol agents, for more administrative personnel, to help secure the border as well, and also changing the standard on the asylum process, which is already, I think, causing and exacerbating the problem that we're having. And he says no to that. And I support it, but he's saying no. And he's saying no, and he's also at the same time admitting that he's worried that if he does that, it's going to impact the elections in November. And what he's saying when he's saying that is, I don't want to fix the problem because I want to run on the problem. And that to me has to be so outrageous to every single Texan. And I'm tired of folks going down to Brownsville, where my family's from, or to El Paso, and using it like a political safari. And they're, kind of trying to get in the weeds and point out migrants. And what we need them to do is help us pass legislation to address this. We're the United States of America, we're Texans. This is not beyond our capacity to have a secure, fair border where we treat people in a humane way, but that also, and sometimes will have to be tough. But it has to be, I think, in a humane way. We can do this, but we have to have leaders who actually want to.
When was the last time you went to the border, and did you get a chance to interact with some of the people trying to come across?
Yeah, well, I was just in El Paso, and of course I've been in the Valley quite a bit. And I've crossed over the border and spoken to migrants who were coming, and I've heard some of their, quite honestly, horrific stories of what they've been through on their journey to try and come to the United States. And I am sympathetic to that. That we're a nation of immigrants, and I want to make sure that our legal immigration system is working much better than it is. We haven't passed comprehensive reform to our immigration system since Ronald Reagan was in the White House. I mean, that's a long time. And I think it's because of folks like Ted Cruz. I am quite confident that John Cornyn and I could sit down together and pass a comprehensive immigration to our reform to our immigration system that would secure our border, but also put our immigration system on a much better footing for our economy heading forward.
So say you get elected and you're working alongside Senator Cornyn. What's something specifically you think you can tackle right away?
I think there are three components that I know that we have to do. One, of course, is security. We do need more personnel. And when I speak to our Border Patrol agents, they talk to me about that all the time. I'm very concerned, actually, about the mental health of our Border Patrol agents. I've heard stories about folks who are being asked to work so much overtime that they're seeing breakdowns in their home life. And they're experiencing a lot of losses in terms of folks leaving the Border Patrol because it's become such a difficult job. So we need more personnel. That's certainly true. We need more technology, and in places, at times I've supported some, physical barriers where the experts say it will be helpful. So that's the security component, and that will be one important component to it. The other one, as I mentioned, is reforming our legal immigration system to make sure that we can attract the best and the brightest from around the world and do it in a way that's not so onerous or so difficult to get through that folks feel like it's not going to work. Every employer I hear from here in Dallas and also across our state is telling me the same thing, which is they want more workers and they want to do it in a legal fashion, but the system we have isn't working. And the third component is dealing with the folks who are here, who have been here for a long time, who are undocumented, particularly our dreamers, and providing them with a pathway out of the shadows to find a way to either into citizenship or to find a way and to be able to working legally and I think consistent with our values.
A campaign stop at an Austin women's clinic highlights one of the starkest divides between Colin Allred and Ted Cruz. We hear from both men about their different approaches to reproductive rights for women and their perspectives on the debate over abortion and in vitro fertilization.
Downtown has changed so much since I was growing up here.
Plus, we take time to get to know the candidates.
I was literally 17 and on my own. My parents had no money to pay for college. They were in bankruptcy.
Personal stories that helped shape the men now running to represent you in the Senate. Ted Cruz and Colin Allred, two names Texas voters will see on the ballot this November in the race for U.S. Senate. Ted Cruz, the Republican incumbent. The son of a Cuban immigrant, Cruz was sworn into the U.S. Senate in 2013. You have served 2 terms. Going for a third, Allred, the Democratic congressman, raised in Dallas, his mother, a public school teacher. You've talked about growing up with a single mom, knowing what it's like to say a little prayer when you swipe the debit card at the checkout. Allred worked as a civil rights attorney after a career in the NFL. I sat down with both candidates, Cruz in his living room in Houston, the city he's called home most of his life, and Allred in downtown Dallas at a restaurant that gives teens coming out of the juvenile justice system tools to build a brighter future.
They learn how to cook gourmet meals. They work every single aspect of the restaurant, from the serving to on the finance side to the desserts. And this is actually my wife and I's favorite dinner spot. And the kids serve you. And they come out and get to hear about them and learn about their lives. And then, since I've been coming here so long, now I get to see the success stories of how they're doing on the other side.
Tell me about that. So these kids, without this kind of opportunity, what do you think would happen to them?
Yeah. Well, these are the kids that often get left behind and who can fall through the cracks. And who, as I said, for various reasons, sometimes it's not their fault. Sometimes it is. But they get wrapped up in the criminal justice system as kids and end up becoming then adult offenders if they don't have some intervention. And this place does that. And it's got all these great mottos on the walls, and my wife and I have those plates over there on our walls, it's a really special place. And for me, as somebody who was raised by a single mom here in Dallas, who went to our public schools here, and who went to school with a lot of kids who also ran into these kind of situations, I think it's a really special place.
What's your go-to meal?
Well, it changes all the time. It's a gourmet meal, and so it's not one of those things where you can come in and have like a bunch of choices on the menu.
Okay.
They'll have a few selections, and they'll all be really good. And I promise you, if you come here, you really can't miss.
What's the best thing you've eaten here?
Their desserts are fantastic.
These days a lot of politics is a lot of theatrics, fiery rhetoric, and passion. You're just naturally just kind of even-tempered. Do you worry that people might mistake that for a lack of passion?
Yeah, I guess, of course you would worry about it, but I also think that we have enough folks in our politics who are doing the stunt stuff that I don't think we need any more. And I also think we've seen how unproductive that is. And so listen, if there certainly is a time for passion, and I will always show that, and anybody who played football with me I think would recognize that I've certainly got that in my game. But I try to keep a level head, as I said, in part because that's also how you make good decisions. And that's what ultimately I think we're trying to pick someone to do, is make some good choices for us and for our families. Across here. Yeah. Downtown has changed so much since I was growing up here, and the light rail just came by. I'm actually on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I've gotten a lot of money for our light rail to try and make it a viable option for folks. And this is how our great cities in Texas come together, as having leaders at the local level, state level, the federal level, investing in things like Thanksgiving Square, which is a public-private joint venture, and the light rail, which obviously public transportation, some of these great buildings here that house some of the top Fortune 500 companies in the country. It all comes together, I think, right here in downtown Dallas.
I'm sure you said you've seen Dallas change a lot. Texas has changed a lot.
Yeah, it has. We've had so many people who've moved here. The growth that we've experienced has a lot of advantages to us. It makes us a place where companies are growing, where folks want to invest, but it also means that our infrastructure gets stressed, that we need more investment in our water systems and so many different things. But I think it's a good thing, and I welcome folks to Texas, and I think that what we've seen is that by and large, a lot of folks around the country do want to come here. That's part of why I think it's so important that we go in a different direction as a state, because we're at a moment now where the extremism that he's pursued has put all of this growth that we have at risk, because there are folks in these buildings who are having conversations about whether or not the state's political climate has become too extreme for the folks they want to bring here or for the companies they want to grow here.
So tell us how your family arrived in Texas.
Well, my dad, as I said, came to Texas in 1957 to go to UT, and so he came from Cuba. My mom was born in Wilmington, Delaware. She's Irish and Italian, and when she was in high school, her dad was transferred to Houston. So she came to Houston, and she ended up being the first fat person in her family ever to go to college. And she applied to Rice, and she got into Rice. And actually, nobody in the family even knew that Rice was Rice, that it's the incredible school it is. It just was the university that was 2 miles away from where her parents were living. And so she applied, she got in, and so she graduated in 1956 from Rice with a math degree. And both my parents were computer programmers. And really at the dawn of the computer age, my mom in the 1950s, my dad in the 1960s, and then they became small business owners. They started a small business here in Houston in oil and gas, doing seismic data processing. They hired me as a kid. I was 8 years old, and they hired me as a computer operator, paid me $1 an hour to run what were Raytheon 704, 706 computers, big wall-sized computers.
Yeah, size of a room, right?
With the tapes and the key punches and things. And so I did that as a kid. By the way, I will say I think it is a great experience. It is amazing how many successful people worked as kids. I think it's really useful for kids to go work. If your parents have a business, go to work and go to work early. It's great discipline. I'm very glad I did it. But I grew up here in Houston as the kid of two small business owners. And I'm a lifelong Houstonian. My dad now is a pastor. So, we saw the ups and downs. There were times when the small business did really well and we felt like, wow, this is going great. Mm-hmm. But then you remember the mid-'80s, oil prices crashed. Mm-hmm. And listen, oil and gas has always been a boom and bust industry. Well, for us, when they crashed, we went bankrupt. My parents lost everything. We lost our home. We lost our business. They had nothing. And I was a junior in high school. And so when I went to college, I was literally 17 and on my own. My parents had no money to pay for college. They were in bankruptcy. And so at 17 years old, I applied and got into Princeton. Nobody we knew had ever gone to a school like Princeton. That was a very different world. But I showed up there and I was 17 and financially on my own. So I went and got 2 jobs and took a bunch of student loans. And between college and grad school, came out with about $100,000 in student loans that took me 20 years to pay off. But look, that experience I think is really valuable. Growing up in a small business, growing up in a family in Texas that is working to achieve the American dream. That's a big part of, I'll tell you, Daniel, honestly, I literally jump out of bed every morning. I jump out of bed excited because I think, number one, I'm really frightened about where our country is. I think we're on the wrong track. I think the policies we're putting in place are really harmful. But number two, all of us are the product of our family story. You are, I am, every one of us. The family story that brought us here is a big part of who we are. For me, I grew up as a kid. My dad fought in the Cuban Revolution. He was imprisoned and tortured. My aunt, my tia Sonia, who I call my tia Loca.
We'll have one of those.
And I promise you, by the way, she would wear chancletas, these rubber sandals. And when I was misbehaving with her daughter, my cousin Bibi, who she and I are like brother and sister, and we would be misbehaving, my tia Sonia would pull off her chancleta, and at 30 feet she could throw it, boom, hit you in the back of the head, literally drop you across the living room. She was deadly with a chancleta. But I would sit on the floor at the feet of my dad and my aunt, and they would tell stories of the Cuban Revolution because my tia Sonia was also imprisoned and tortured in Cuba. And Bibi and I would listen to it, and I'll tell you, from when I was 3, 4, 5 years old, all I ever wanted to do was fight for freedom. That when you're raised in a Cuban household where you've seen freedom taken away, there's an urgency to it. And so there is not a day that I am not amazed. Like, holy cow, how do I get to have this opportunity to be in the arena, to be fighting for America, to be fighting for 30 million Texans? That is an extraordinary privilege and one for which I'm immensely grateful.
Texas law bans almost all abortions. Allred wants to change that at the federal level.
We've seen a right that has been granted for over 50 years in the United States ripped away from Texas women.
Cruz putting emphasis on a different aspect of reproductive rights.
Let's draft legislation that is simple, that is straightforward, that protects IVF. Ironclad protection so that nobody needs to be afraid. Nobody needs to be confused.
Views from both candidates on the debate over abortion and in vitro fertilization. Plus, concern over the cost of living.
When you grow up the way I did, I think you have a sensitivity to what it means for eggs to be more expensive. I mean, I know what it's like to go through the checkout line and have to put things back.
A key issue affecting people across the nation. Ranking member of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and an issue often at the center of congressional gridlock. From that vantage point, what can you all do to get these prices down for everyone?
Look, it's a great question.
So I asked both candidates to get specific about their plans to address rising prices at the gas pump, the grocery store, and beyond. Your kind of unapologetic conservative persona, with what the job is, having to get things done in a bipartisan way.
Well, listen, I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I am a principled conservative, and I don't run away from that at all. But I'd also say, look at my record.
It is possible to bridge some of these seemingly unbridgeable divides, both in our politics and our society, and I want to be one of those folks who can do that.
And for people at home who think, it just seems like it's always a stalemate in Washington, maybe it does take someone who just fights all the time. Maybe extremism is the way to go. What would you say to that?
Well, I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We have not been getting things done that we need to be getting done. We have not been delivering for Texans in a way that I think we should be.
You're watching Campaign Context and Texas's race for U.S. Senate.
Welcome back. I'm Daniel Marin. Getting back to our in-depth look at the U.S. Senate race here in Texas as Democratic Congressman Colin Allred challenges incumbent Republican Senator Ted Cruz for the seat that he's held for more than a decade. I recently traveled to Dallas and Houston and sat down with each candidate. Allred in a downtown Dallas restaurant that provides culinary training for teens recently released from the juvenile justice system, and Cruz in his living room in Houston. Moving into the second half of our wide-ranging conversation, I asked both candidates about their specific game plans when it comes to addressing rising consumer prices. You've talked about growing up with a single mom, knowing what it's like to say a little prayer when you swipe the debit card at the checkout. What's the game plan to combat rising prices that are affecting everybody, restaurants like this? That's right. We have to tackle this. And when you grow up the way I did, I think you have a sensitivity to what it means for eggs to be more expensive. I mean, I know what it's like to go through the checkout line and have to put things back because you couldn't afford that this week. And I know what that feeling is. And as a parent now, I certainly understand how devastating that would be to have to do that for my kids. And so that's why I've always been so focused on lowering folks' costs everywhere I can. From your healthcare costs, I'm proud that we capped the cost of insulin at $35 a month for folks who are on Medicare. I voted for that. Ted Cruz voted against it again. He also prevented us from capping that for folks who aren't on Medicare, but we have seen some providers already lower their cost of insulin to match that. They're also trying to combat things like your childhood costs. I'm the first member of Congress to ever take paternity leave, and I use that as an example to try and talk about why it's necessary for us now to have a national paid leave policy where folks, when they have a child or when they have a life event, that they're able to take some time off while also still not leaving their job. A lot of good companies are already doing that because they know it increases productivity and helps them retain their workers. We should have a national policy around that. And we have to also continue to make sure that we're good stewards, of course, of the public dollars. And I've been proud of trying to make sure that we do that, and I want to be even more aggressive on that going forward. What I see from Ted Cruz is somebody who I don't think is interested at all in lowering folks' everyday costs, who really is only looking out for the wealthiest and the best connected. Is there a game plan there?
Yeah. Well, we are still coming out of a pandemic, and I think we have to remember that just a few years ago, we were all sat at home, or then when we came out, there were still things that weren't open, and we're still seeing some of that tail effects of that. But I do think the game plan overall has to be to make sure that we continue to grow the economy. We're continuing to see economic growth, but we have to bring down inflation. And I think that has to be a joint effort, both with the Federal Reserve, which we've seen what they're doing, but also with the Congress making smart fiscal policy when it comes to our tax policy, yes, but also with the investments that we make, so that we're not, when we make these investments that keep folks in dollars in folks' pockets, that we're not also having an inflationary impact.
Ranking member of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, from that vantage point, what can you all do to get these prices down for everyone?
Look, it's a great question, and in terms of inflation, there are three things we can do. Number one, we've got to stop spending money we don't have. The reason inflation has taken off is because the Democrats spent trillions of dollars we didn't have, borrowed trillions of dollars we didn't have, printed trillions of dollars we didn't have. That's driven up costs for Texans who are hurting everywhere. Number two, a big part of inflation is energy. And Joe Biden and the Democrats, including Colin Allred, have waged a war on Texas oil and gas producers. Joe Biden put a ban in place on new permits to export liquid natural gas. That hurt jobs in Texas. It hurt our allies. It helped our enemies. And amazingly enough, Colin Allred voted in favor of Joe Biden's ban on additional LNG export permits. Those are policies that hurt. If and when we win in November, we're going to end that war on energy, and we're going to lower the cost of energy. And what that's going to do is lower the cost of everything else, because energy is reflected in the cost of everything else. But number three, I would say infrastructure is critically important to lowering costs. And as the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, and if we get a majority in November, I think we will, I'll be the chairman of the Commerce Committee, which is really good for Texas. In terms of fighting for jobs in Texas, I would point to, in terms of infrastructure, number one, 2 freeways. I-14, which will run from the Permian Basin east all the way through East Texas, all the way ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean to Georgia. I was the lead author of I-14, that legislation. I did it with Raphael Warnock, a liberal Democrat from Georgia, and Cruz Warnock. We passed it into law. That interstate is going to help create thousands of high-paying jobs. And then secondly, I-27. I-27 is going to run from Laredo north through West Texas, through the Panhandle, through New Mexico, ultimately all the way north to Canada. I-27, again, I was the lead author of that. That I did with Ben Ray Lujan, a Democrat from New Mexico. Cruz Lujan passed into law. Those two together are going to be responsible for billions of dollars of economic activity in Texas and thousands upon thousands of high-paying jobs. And I would say also, if you look at the Rio Grande Valley, you look at South Texas, there are right now 4 new pending bridge projects in South Texas. 2 new bridges in Laredo, 1 in Brownsville, 1 in Eagle Pass. All 4 of those bridge projects were being delayed by bureaucratic roadblocks that the Biden administration had put in place. And the Biden White House was delaying those projects by 3, 4, 5 years. It made no sense. The city leaders of Laredo came to me, mostly Democrats. They said, Ted, would you help me? We are frustrated by this White House that they're blocking these bridges. I said, absolutely. I worked, unified the South Texas congressional delegation. We brought together every Republican, every Democrat in the South Texas delegation, all fighting together for these bridges. Ultimately, I authored legislation that expedited the permitting for all 3 bridges, that put a shot clock on the White House. It gave the president 120 days, and it said, you have 120 days to grant or deny the permits, and if you do nothing, the permits will be deemed granted automatically by operation of law. That bill was signed into law on December 22nd of last year. Actually, it was my birthday. It was a great birthday present. And just a few weeks ago, the White House finally granted the permits for those bridges. Those bridges, every year Texas does about $800 billion of trade and commerce with Mexico. Those bridges are going to result in tens of thousands of high-paying jobs, in billions more of economic activity. They're going to help every Texas farmer, every Texas rancher, every small business, every manufacturer, and they're going to help consumers because they reduce the cost of goods getting to the grocery store, of goods getting to the store, and so it is a win-win for Texas, and it's an example of what we can do when we're focused on fighting for jobs in the state of Texas.
I also spoke at length with both candidates on their starkly divided views on reproductive rights. Cruz praised the 2022 Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. He called it a massive victory for life. The Dobbs decision gives states the power to decide abortion policy, and Texas now has laws that ban almost all abortions. Allred has called for legislation to restore Roe v. Wade, giving federal protection to abortion access. And on the anniversary of the Dobbs decision, Allred campaigned at a women's clinic in Austin, highlighting concerns about Texas women being blocked from medically necessary abortions. He's also blamed abortion restrictions backed by Cruz for threatening access to in vitro fertilization, or IVF. But Senator Cruz says he's fighting to protect IVF. He filed legislation to prevent states from blocking access to the procedure. But Democrats have their own bill that aims to protect IVF, though neither bill has advanced in the Senate. The issue playing out politically and personally for both voters and the candidates. As I'm sure that you are aware, at a recent Southern Baptist convention, they passed a resolution raising some concerns about IVF. Now, given your background, how do you wrestle with that as a Southern Baptist?
And I'm not a pastor. I'm not a theologian. And pastors can work to lay out their views of faith. That's their job. My job is to represent 30 million Texans. And I can tell you what I think. I strongly support IVF. I think IVF is a medical miracle. If you look at IVF has enabled millions of parents, millions of hopeful moms and dads to bring into the world a little baby, a boy, a little girl. You know, every year right now in the United States, about 2% of all of the births in America come from IVF. There are over 8 million babies that have been born through IVF. I think it is extraordinarily pro-family. And I have many, many dear friends whose children were conceived through IVF. Now, we're at a time politically where a lot of parents are confused and they're concerned. They're concerned that IVF might be in jeopardy. And the Alabama Supreme Court decision contributed to that. And frankly, there are more than a few Democrats who are deliberately trying to spread that confusion because they think it's politically beneficial to them. Well, as far as I know, all 100 senators support IVF. There's literally no debate on the question of IVF in the U.S. Senate. So I went to Alabama Senator Katie Britt, and I said, Katie, you support IVF, I support IVF. Let's draft legislation that is simple, that is straightforward, that protects IVF, that puts it in federal law, an ironclad protection so that nobody needs to be afraid. Nobody needs to be confused that you know that you as an American citizen have a right to access IVF technology and that no state, no local government can ban IVF. We drafted that. We filed it. Now, it's the sort of bill that on the merits, it should pass 100-0. As I said, there's literally not a single Republican, not a single Democrat who disagrees with IVF. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, Katie and I, we went to the Senate floor to try to pass my legislation. We stood up and asked for unanimous consent to pass it, and the Democrats stood up and objected. The reason our bill didn't pass is because the Democrats blocked it. And their reason for blocking it is really cynical. The Democrats don't want to pass a strong protection of IVF into federal law. Why? Because they want to spend millions of dollars in November telling the voters the mean Republicans want to take away IVF. Never mind that we're all supporting a bill to protect IVF. This is about politics and misdirection. So I thought it was one of the most cynical moments I've ever seen in the Senate when the Democrats blocked legislation, my strong legislation protecting IVF, because they want to run TV ads on it instead.
But when you're going back to the vote at the Southern Baptist Convention, when you saw that vote, what goes through your mind as a Southern Baptist?
Everyone is entitled to make their own faith determinations. And in my view, your relationship with your Creator is your relationship with your Creator. I'm a Christian. It's a very important part. My faith is an important part of my life. But at the end of the day, my job in the Senate is not to be anyone's pastor. My job in the Senate is to fight every day for 30 million Texans, to fight for jobs, to fight for freedom, to fight for security. Those are my top three priorities: jobs, freedom, and security. And fundamentally, the freedom, look, for a mom or dad who desperately wants to love a child, IVF has proven to be an extraordinary miracle.
Your father, you just said in 2019, unbeknownst to you, you became the first congressman to take paternity leave. You've spoken out against the state's abortion law. Your opponents and other Republicans who support really strict restrictions on abortion say that they're trying to protect life. That's the phrase you hear a lot, protecting life. How does that phrase strike you?
Yeah. Well, what I've seen is that this is a law that has gone way too far. And that this is the predictable outcome of what extremists like Ted Cruz have been saying for decades and now have made into a reality here in Texas. And what it looks like in Texas is that it's over 20,000 Texas women have been forced to give birth to their rapist child. That's not my number, that's the Houston Chronicle's number. It looks like mothers like Lauren Miller. She's an 8th generation Texan. She already was a mother and got pregnant with twins. One of the twins wasn't going to make it and was actually killing the other one and her. And her doctor here in Dallas said that she was going to have to leave the state to get the care that she needed. And she had to go to Colorado to get treated. Or Kate Cox, who I mentioned, who was already a mother and who had to go to the emergency room 4 times. And her doctor said she needed a medically necessary abortion and couldn't get it close to home. Or Dr. Austin Denard, who's a friend of mine and who's an OBGYN herself, whose husband is also an OBGYN, who noticed herself on her own ultrasound the baby's skull wasn't forming, and she could not get the care she needed close to home and had to leave our state. And these are multi-generation Texans who are being forced by this extreme law to have to go somewhere else to get treated by some other doctor who they've never met, in some place they've never been, staying in some hotel, having to find childcare for the kids they already have. That's how far this law has gone. But it also has, I think, an impact that we're not talking about on our businesses and on our university systems, and that we are only beginning to see, which is that folks are already starting to say that they don't want to send their kids to school in Texas And our medical schools, we're seeing changes in who's applying to come here. They're having a harder time attracting and retaining talent. And the same thing I'm hearing from a lot of business leaders, that when they're trying to bring someone in or keep someone who's talented here, this is part of their conversation they're having to have with them. Well, what if I want to start a family? How's this law going to impact me? It's going to impact every aspect of our lives, and we have to reverse it.
When the argument gets positioned as such to where it seems that Democrats are protecting women's rights and those in favor of strict abortion rules and laws are protecting life, as a father, how do those words strike you?
Yeah. Well, my wife and I have been blessed with 2 healthy pregnancies, 2 beautiful baby boys here in Dallas in the last 5 years at Baylor, not far from where we're sitting right now. There's nothing more important to me than protecting life and protecting their lives and to making sure that they have everything that they need. What I often see from folks like Ted Cruz when they talk about that is that they talk about it in a very narrow context, but then once you have that child, they're not there at all. They want to talk about early childhood education. They don't want to talk about childcare. They don't want to talk about pre-K. They don't want to talk about paid leave. They don't want to talk about investing in public education. They're saying basically, you're on your own. To me, when you want to talk about how can we best support families here in Texas, we have to have a comprehensive system because it's really hard right now. Most daycares won't even take a kid until they're past 6 months, right? It's really hard in Texas to have a child and to be working and to keep providing for your family. And that's also costing us in terms of our economy. And we've seen time and time again that when you have policies that are pro-family, like early childhood care, like universal pre-K, like access to paid family leave, that it also has more of an economic impact because then you have more workers in the system who are also more efficient and who are happier in their work, they're more productive. It's an overall benefit to our society. And so to me, that's the holistic approach that we have to take, is that we want to make sure that we have as few unplanned pregnancies as possible. So let's invest in that. But then let's also make sure that women can make their own healthcare decisions about their bodies in consultation with their doctors and with their faith.
Last month, you were in Austin at a women's center on the anniversary of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Why was it important for you to be there that day?
Well, I think it's a dark anniversary in a lot of ways. It's one of the first times that I'm aware of that we've seen a right that has been granted for over 50 years in the United States ripped away from Texas women. And when I talk to so many Texas women, including my mom, they're shocked that here we are at this stage and that we're still having some of these fights. In fact, that these rights have been taken away.
We've heard how Cruz and Allred differ on the issues, but I wanted to find out what inspires them.
Remember, it's not about you. It's about them. It's about their families. It's about their kids. It's about their future. It's about their dreams.
The answers reveal distinctly different styles, but also some common ground.
The same boat now. We're all Americans. We're all Texans. We have some really common values that we share. Let's get back to some of those.
We dig deeper into the ideas that motivate the candidates running to represent you in Washington. Welcome back to Campaign Context in Texas's race for U.S. Senate. I had in-depth conversations with incumbent Senator Ted Cruz and challenger Congressman Colin Allred, 2 Texans hoping to fill a Senate seat in Washington for the next 6 years. And before we wrap up, I wanted to learn more about the driving force behind the candidates' leadership styles. Allred told me he learned the strength that comes with keeping his cool on the football field, while Cruz said his approach as a leader goes beyond his unapologetic fighter persona.
I've said a lot of times the difference between Republicans and Democrats, that Republicans' office, I think Republicans are terrible communicators, and that they communicate with their left brain. They communicate with logic. And so you get Republicans that get up and they put a green eye shade on, and they put up a pie chart, and they say, if you look at the long-term actuarial soundness of the Social Security system, and listen, for those of us who care about numbers and facts, you can hear an argument and say, yeah, we need to do something to protect and save Social Security. That's persuasive. But a lot of people don't think that way. And Democrats, Republicans try to appeal to your brain. Democrats typically go for your heart. And so Democrats will just say, he wants to eat your children. And by the way, the heart is much more effective than the brain. If you were to pick one, There's no doubt the heart is more effective. What I think is most effective is to use both. It is to appeal to reason and logic and explain, but explain it in a way that it matters to you and your family. You know, the best political advice I ever got in my life was early on, right when I was first running for office. I was getting ready to give a campaign speech somewhere. And Heidi told me, Ted, she said, remember, it's not about you. It's about them. It's about their families. It's about their kids. It's about their future. It's about their dreams. And you get so many political candidates, politicians that jump on stage, and the only word out of their mouth is I. That's something to this day, before I talk to any group, I try to remember that it's not about you, it's about them. And if you can talk about what they care about, if you can make it relevant to their life, that's powerful. And so, you know, I think we need more real conversations. Look, I've enjoyed you and I've been talking. We talked briefly before about the podcast. Part of the reason I do the podcast is because it's a great way to talk unfiltered. You know, if you're in the political world, you do TV interviews, you do radio interviews, they're typically 6 to 8 minutes. It means you have to talk in kind of little 30-second sound bites because you don't have time to really explain something, so you sort of have to have a couple of points and get out. What I love about the podcast, look, we do it 3 days a week, and it's typically 30 to 45 minutes. There's no set time. So if there's a topic, we'll talk as long as there's something useful to say about it. And I got to say, I really like the format because you can get in and explain it and get into substance and talk about what's actually going on. And I think our politics would be a lot better if people talk to each other more.
We just have a couple more minutes. My question is, do you lead more with emotion, or do you like to think things through? What's your style?
Yeah. Well, I think I've become, pretty well known for keeping my cool and for always being one of the calmer people, even when everything is going to heck all around me. I think I developed that in my NFL career, where the idea was to perform, losing your head's not going to help, right? And I think that's also true when it comes to legislation or responding to the issues of the day. That kind of snap judgment that you might make in the first moment is not always, to me, the one that's wisest and most prudent. If you think things through and also put yourself in the shoes of someone who you might disagree with, you can sometimes find yourself understanding, well, maybe this is more gray than black and white. And I'm somebody who's comfortable with that. When I see Ted Cruz, I see somebody who I think sees everything in such stark terms, that it's either black or it's white, and he's always going to be fighting it. And to me, that's not my experience of life, and I don't think it is most Texans either. That often things are very complicated, and that smart people are often working hard to try and solve them. And that well-meaning people are out there who want to be consulted with. There are well-meaning folks, some of the folks I love the most in the world disagree with me on restoring a woman's right to choose here in Texas. I understand that. I'm a Christian. I went to Baylor. I'm a church-going man. I get it, okay? But I also understand that we need to have a more fulsome conversation about how we can both protect life, consistent, I think, also with protecting individual rights, right? To me, that's the kind of thing where you have to have leaders in place who want to take that approach. But I do think that becoming a father and having 2 young children has fundamentally changed me in the way that every parent, I think, can say the same. Because it has extended my view into the future so much more in terms of my concern about their future and what country and what state they're going to inherit. And I want to make sure that they have the opportunities, of course, that I had, but also that they inherit a state and a country that's not just destroyed by divisions and that's not at each other's throats, but one that does have, yes, important differences at times, but that fundamentally understands, I think as John Lewis used to tell us, that we might have come here on different ships. We're in the same boat now. We're all Americans. We're all Texans. We have some really common values that we share. Let's get back to some of those.
Okay, Congressman, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Only 4 months to go until Election Day, and campaign season is really about to ramp up. Up next, Senator Cruz and Congressman Allred head to their respective party conventions. The Republican National Convention kicks off in Milwaukee on July 15th. The Democratic National Convention is in Chicago on August 19th. And it only heats up from there, but we'll be there every step of the way, delivering the context and depth you need in order to make an informed decision this fall. I'm Daniel Marin. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a good night.